A group of men on horseback, legal professionals traveling the circuit, had paused to water their mounts in a thicket of wild plum and crabapple trees. As they prepared to move on, they noticed one of their party was missing. He was the tallest among them, a man whose thoughtful silence often set him apart. When a friend rode back to find him, the scene was not one of political discussion or legal debate. Instead, Abraham Lincoln was carefully, gently, placing two small birds, blown from their nest by the violent wind, back into the safety of their mother's care. When he finally rejoined his companions, their light-hearted laughter at his delay was met with a simple, earnest gravity that silenced them. "I could not have slept tonight," Lincoln explained, "if I had not given those two little birds to their mother." This quiet moment, far from the battlefields and council chambers that would define his legacy, offers a profound glimpse into the character of the man who would guide the nation through its most trying hour. It was not an isolated incident, but a manifestation of a deep and consistent personal ethic. Lincoln's compassion was a current that ran through his entire life, extending to the most vulnerable of creatures. As a boy on the rugged frontier, where cruelty to animals was commonplace, he stood apart. His boyhood friend, Nathaniel Grigsby, recalled that Lincoln would actively chide us for tormenting turtles, even taking the time to write short sentences against cruelty to animals. His stepsister, Matilda Johnson, remembered a teenage Lincoln who would argue that an ant's life was to it, as sweet as ours. He was, in the words of his stepmother, a lifelong lover of animals, who treated them kindly. This was not the sentimentality of a sheltered youth. It was the principled conviction of a developing mind that saw inherent value in all life. On another occasion, seeing a pig struggling and trapped in deep mud, Lincoln did not hesitate to wade in and help the creature free itself, an act of simple kindness that revealed a profound capacity for empathy. This personal philosophy did not wane when he ascended to the presidency. Amidst the immense pressures of the Civil War, the White House became a sanctuary for a menagerie of animals that brought the commander-in-chief visible comfort. His fondness for cats was well known. He doted on two kittens, Tabby and Dixie, given to him by Secretary of State William Seward. At a formal dinner, when his wife, Mary, admonished him for feeding Tabby from the table with a gold fork, Lincoln famously replied with a gentle wit that underscored his conviction. "If the gold fork was good enough for former President James Buchanan, I think it is good enough for Tabby." He would often sit with one of the cats in his lap, talking to it for long stretches, finding a quiet companionship that eluded him in the world of men. His affection extended to a pair of goats, Nanny and Nanko, who were given free rein of the White House grounds, much to the occasional consternation of his cabinet. During the siege of Petersburg in March 1865, just weeks before his death, Admiral David Porter was struck by the sight of the president, weary from the burdens of war, tenderly caressing 3 stray kittens. Lincoln whispered to them, "Kitties, thank God you are cats and can't understand this terrible strife that is going on." Lincoln's compassion for animals was not a quirk of personality. It was the most personal and sincere expression of his public philosophy. His call for malice toward none and charity for all was a universal principle he applied consistently, whether to a divided nation or a fallen fledgling. In an era defined by the doctrine of manifest destiny, an age that viewed the natural world as a limitless resource to be conquered and exploited, Lincoln's actions represented a quiet but powerful counter-narrative. He demonstrated a sense of stewardship and mercy that was decades ahead of its time. This profound respect for the most vulnerable established a high standard for the nation's highest office, a precedent of principled compassion that would lie dormant for a generation before re-emerging in the actions of another transformative president. Lincoln's quiet defense of the defenseless set a moral stage, posing a question that the nation would be forced to confront. Could the individual conscience of a great leader become the collective conscience of a great nation? The answer would be forged in the crucible of a continental-scale tragedy. From the quiet, personal act of a future president saving 2 birds, the historical lens widens to a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. The story of the American bison is the story of what happens when a nation lacks a collective conservation ethic, when the impulse of exploitation overwhelms any sense of stewardship. For centuries, the Great Plains of North America were home to one of the planet's most awe-inspiring natural spectacles, the thundering herds of the American bison. Numbering between 30 and 60 million, these magnificent animals moved across the landscape like a living sea, shaping the very ecosystem they inhabited. They were the dominant grazers, the keystone species of the vast prairie and a symbol of the continent's seemingly inexhaustible abundance. For the indigenous peoples of the plains, the bison was the center of life, providing food, shelter, and tools. The herds were not just a resource, they were a fundamental part of a spiritual and cultural cosmology. The speed of their destruction is one of the most shocking chapters in American history. The westward expansion of the 19th century, fueled by the construction of transcontinental railways, created an industrial-scale killing machine. Market demand for hides in the East and in Europe turned the plains into a vast abattoir. Hunters, armed with powerful long-range rifles, could kill dozens of animals from a single position, taking only the skins and leaving mountains of carcasses to rot under the sun. By the early 1800s, the bison had already been eliminated east of the Mississippi River, but it was in the decades following the Civil War that the slaughter reached its terrible crescendo. However, this was not merely a story of commercial greed or the unforeseen consequences of westward settlement. The annihilation of the bison was also an instrument of national policy. The U.S. government recognized that the Plains tribes' resistance to expansion was inextricably linked to their reliance on the bison herds. Therefore, a deliberate and systematic campaign was undertaken to eliminate the animal as a means of subduing the people who depended upon it. Military commanders and politicians openly endorsed the slaughter, understanding that destroying the bison was a more effective tool of conquest than direct warfare. This calculated policy fused commercial avarice with military strategy, accelerating the pace of destruction and transforming a tragedy into a targeted campaign of ecological and cultural warfare. The result was a biological cataclysm. In a few short decades, the herds that had numbered in the tens of millions were reduced to a few scattered, terrified remnants. By 1889, it was estimated that only 541 Plains bison remained in the entire United States. The thundering sound that had once defined the American interior was replaced by a profound and haunting silence. A census conducted in 1905 confirmed the grim reality. A mere 835 wild bison and 256 animals held in captivity were all that was left of the once mighty herds. Sanctuaries, private ranches, and zoos became the last desperate arks for a species pushed to the absolute brink of extinction. The near extinction of the American bison was more than the loss of a single species. It was a national trauma that exposed the dark side of the nation's expansionist creed. The empty plains served as a stark and undeniable monument to a catastrophic failure of foresight and morality. Yet, from the depths of this tragedy, a new consciousness began to stir. The shock of the bison's demise served as the critical catalyst for a national awakening. The abstract idea of protecting nature, once the domain of a few thoughtful individuals like Lincoln, became a tangible, urgent crisis. The silence on the plains was so deafening that it forced the nation to listen, to question its own trajectory, and to search for a new voice, a voice that could speak not of conquest, but of conservation. This crisis created the necessary political and social space for new ideas and new leaders to emerge. Individuals who would argue that America's greatness lay not in its ability to exhaust its natural wonders, but in its wisdom to preserve them. The deafening silence on the Great Plains prompted a profound question. If the nation could not prevent the slaughter of its most iconic animal, could it at least protect its most sacred landscapes? The first major answer to this question came not from the empty prairies, but from the granite cathedrals of California's Sierra Nevada. It was here that a new kind of American hero emerged, a man who wielded not a rifle, but a pen, and whose philosophy would lay the foundation for the modern environmental movement. His name was John Muir. Born in Scotland in 1838, Muir immigrated to Wisconsin as a boy. A near-blinding industrial accident in his youth changed the course of his life, driving him to abandon the world of machines and enroll in what he called the University of Wilderness. In 1868, at the age of 30, he walked into Yosemite Valley for the first time and was, in his own words, overwhelmed. He saw not just rock and water, but a living temple, a place of profound spiritual significance. He decided to stay, working in a sawmill but spending every spare moment exploring, studying the region's botany and geology, and developing a deep, almost mystical connection to the land. The idea of protecting Yosemite was not entirely new. The region's wonders had attracted tourists and commercial interest following the California gold rush, leading to significant environmental damage. In 1864, a group of conservationists had persuaded President Abraham Lincoln to sign the Yosemite Grant, an act that set aside Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias as a public trust to be administered by the state of California. This landmark legislation, a direct precursor to the national park system, marked the first time the U.S. government had protected land for public enjoyment and preservation, a quiet echo of the same compassionate impulse Lincoln had shown on the Illinois prairie. But this protection was incomplete. In the late 1880s, Muir discovered that the vast, stunning high country meadows surrounding the state-controlled valley were unprotected and being systematically destroyed by the grazing of domestic sheep. He railed against the damage caused by these animals, which he memorably termed hoofed locusts, recognizing that a sanctuary with porous borders was no sanctuary at all. This realization sparked a new and urgent campaign. In 1889, Muir found a powerful ally in Robert Underwood Johnson, the influential editor of Century magazine. Muir personally guided Johnson through Tuolumne Meadows, showing him firsthand the devastation wrought by the sheep. The experience transformed Johnson into a fervent advocate for the cause. This partnership created a new and formidable model for environmental advocacy. Muir, the passionate naturalist and gifted writer, penned a series of persuasive articles exposing the threats to the Yosemite high country. Johnson, the media-savvy editor, published them, amplifying Muir's voice to a national audience. Their combined efforts ignited public support and created immense political pressure. The campaign culminated on October 1, 1890, when the U.S. Congress, responding to the public outcry, passed a bill creating Yosemite National Park. The act set aside over 2,500 square miles of wilderness under federal protection, creating a vast sanctuary that dwarfed the original state grant. Muir's victory was more than a political or legislative achievement. It was a philosophical one. He and his allies had successfully argued for the preservation of nature not for its utilitarian value, but for its intrinsic spiritual worth. He urged Americans to climb the mountains and get their good tidings, believing that nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine into trees. This was the birth of preservationism as a core tenet of the American conservation movement. The idea that some places are so special, so sacred, that they should be left untouched by commercial exploitation. The campaign for Yosemite established a powerful blueprint for future action, the fusion of scientific observation, passionate prose, strategic media partnerships, and relentless political lobbying. It was a demonstration that the pen could indeed be mightier than the axe, and that a single determined voice could rally a nation to save its greatest natural treasures from destruction. While John Muir was fighting to preserve entire landscapes as sacred temples, a different kind of battle was taking shape on the East Coast. This new front in the burgeoning conservation movement focused not on the grand scale of mountains and valleys, but on the delicate beauty of individual creatures, particularly the nation's birds. The leader of this crusade was a man uniquely positioned to bridge the gap between those who used the wild for sport and those who sought to protect it. George Bird Grinnell. Grinnell's destiny seemed intertwined with the cause of birds from his earliest days. Born in Brooklyn in 1849, his family moved to Audubon Park in New York when he was a boy, where he attended a small school run by Lucy Audubon, the widow of the legendary naturalist and artist John James Audubon. This childhood immersion in the world of the Audubons kindled a lifelong passion for natural history and conservation that would define his career. Grinnell was an avid sportsman and explorer, accompanying scientific expeditions to the West and priding himself on his skills as a hunter. Yet, unlike many of his contemporaries, he was appalled by the wanton destruction of wildlife he witnessed. In 1880, Grinnell became the editor of Forest and Stream, one of the nation's leading sporting publications. He quickly transformed the magazine into a powerful pulpit for conservation. From this influential position, he railed against the culture of market hunting and wasteful slaughter, arguing for the establishment of hunting seasons, bag limits, and a system of game wardens to enforce the law. He was an insider, a respected member of the sporting community, who sought to reform its ethics from within. His message was not anti-hunting, it was anti-slaughter. He argued that true sportsmanship demanded respect for the quarry and a commitment to its preservation for future generations. The primary target of Grinnell's ire was the plume trade. In the late 19th century, it became fashionable for women's hats to be decorated with the feathers, wings, and even entire stuffed bodies of wild birds. This trend created a voracious market that sent hunters into the field to kill birds by the millions. Egrets and herons were particularly prized for their elegant breeding plumes, and hunters would often wipe out entire rookeries, leaving orphaned chicks to starve. This industry brought the reality of wildlife destruction from the remote western plains into the heart of America's cities, making consumers in New York and Boston directly complicit in the slaughter. In response to this crisis, Grinnell took a monumental step. In 1886, in the pages of his magazine, he called for the formation of a new organization dedicated to the protection of wild birds and animals. He named it the Audubon Society, in honor of the family that had inspired him as a child. The idea was an immediate success. Within a year, the society had over 300 chapters and 18,000 members. Grinnell and his staff at Forest and Stream were overwhelmed by the response. Ultimately, this first iteration of the society was short-lived, collapsing within 3 years under the financial and administrative burden. But the seed had been planted. Grinnell's pioneering effort had achieved something crucial. It had shifted the focus of conservation from remote megafauna like the bison to a highly visible and emotionally resonant issue that resonated with the urban public. The crusade against the plume trade framed conservation as a matter of public morality and good taste, and it engaged a new and powerful demographic: women who were instrumental in organizing the local Audubon chapters and would become a driving force in the movement. George Bird Grinnell, the sportsman reformer, had successfully broadened the conservation movement, bringing it out of the wilderness and into the mainstream of American society. He had created a new archetype, the ethical hunter as a passionate conservationist, a model that would soon be embodied by the most powerful man in the country. By the late 1880s, the American conservation movement was animated by several distinct but related impulses. There was the spiritual preservationism of John Muir, fighting to save landscapes, and the moral crusade of George Bird Grinnell, fighting to save species. What was needed was a unifying philosophy, a practical code of conduct that could bring these threads together and translate them into national policy. This synthesis arrived with the formation of an elite and profoundly influential organization founded by two of the era's most dynamic figures, the Boone and Crockett Club. In December 1887, a rising young politician and avid outdoorsman named Theodore Roosevelt gathered a group of prominent men at his residence in New York City. Among them was George Bird Grinnell. Roosevelt proposed the formation of a new club for American hunters, one dedicated not to the mere pursuit of game, but to its preservation. They named it in honor of Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, frontiersmen whom the founders viewed as pioneers who understood the consequences of overharvesting. The club's mission was to address the catastrophic decline of North America's big game populations by promoting ethical hunting practices and advocating for science-based wildlife management. The intellectual cornerstone of the Boone and Crockett Club was the concept of fair chase. The club formally defined this doctrine as the ethical, sportsmanlike, and lawful pursuit and taking of free-ranging wild game animals in a manner that doesn't give the hunter an improper or unfair advantage. This was a revolutionary idea. It drew a sharp, clear line between the true sportsman, who valued the challenge of the hunt and the nobility of the animal, and the market hunter, who sought only to kill the most game by the easiest means possible. The Code of Fair Chase was a direct response to the industrial-scale slaughter that had annihilated the bison. It was an attempt to codify the unspoken, intuitive compassion of a man like Lincoln into a formal set of principles that could be taught, debated, and, most importantly, legislated. The Boone and Crockett Club was far more than a social organization. It was a political and intellectual powerhouse, a veritable think tank for the new conservation movement. Its members, who included influential politicians, scientists, writers, and industrialists, wielded substantial political influence. They worked tirelessly behind the scenes to turn the principles of fair chase and wise resource management into the law of the land. Their legislative achievements were staggering. They spearheaded the efforts that led to the Yellowstone Park Protection Act of 1894, which finally gave the park's wildlife meaningful protection. They were instrumental in the creation of the National Forest Service and the National Wildlife Refuge System, the very architecture of modern American conservation. Their crowning achievement was the passage of the Lacey Act in 1900, a landmark bill that made it a federal crime to transport illegally killed game across state lines, dealing a devastating blow to the commercial market hunting that had plagued the nation for a century. The club represented an unprecedented fusion of power and principle. It brought together the nation's elite to champion a cause that benefited all citizens. It established the enduring idea that hunters themselves should be the primary guardians of wildlife and habitat, a concept that remains central to the North American model of wildlife conservation. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Boone and Crockett Club had laid the legal and ethical framework for a new American relationship with the wild. All that was needed was for its most famous member to ascend to the nation's highest office and personify that new ethic for all the world to see. That moment would arrive in a muddy swamp in Mississippi. All the disparate threads of the American conservation story, the precedent of presidential character, the trauma of the bison slaughter, the preservation of sacred landscapes, the protection of vulnerable species, and the codification of a hunter's honor, converged in a single, dramatic event in November 1902. The setting was a dense canebrake in the Mississippi Delta, and the main actor was the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt, an ardent hunter and a founder of the Boone and Crockett Club, was in Mississippi on a trip invited by Governor Andrew H. Longino. The primary purpose was a bear hunt, but after 3 days, the presidential hunt was proving a failure. While others in the party had been successful, Roosevelt had not seen a single bear. The president's hosts grew concerned. To guide the hunt, they had hired the best in the region, a man of legendary status named Holt Collier. Collier's life story is one of the great unsung narratives of American history. Born into slavery in Mississippi around 1848, he killed his first bear at the age of 10. His skill in the wild was so prodigious that he was tasked with supplying meat for the entire plantation. During the Civil War, he accompanied his master into the Confederate Army, serving with distinction and courage. After the war, he became a professional hunter, a man who navigated the complex and often dangerous social world of the post-Reconstruction South with uncanny confidence and grace. He was credited with killing more than 3,000 bears in his lifetime, and Roosevelt himself would later declare him the greatest hunter he had ever known. Determined that the president would not leave empty-handed, Collier and his hounds pursued a large, 250-pound black bear through the swamp. After a long and arduous chase, the dogs cornered the exhausted animal in a slough. To save his favorite dog from the bear's fury, Collier stunned the Bruin with a blow from his rifle stock, lassoed the semi-conscious animal, and tied it to a willow tree. He then sent for the president. When Roosevelt arrived on the scene, he was met with a sight that violated every principle he held dear. Before him was not a wild and free-ranging animal, but an old, injured, and tethered creature, a helpless target. Despite being encouraged by others in the hunting party to take his shot, Roosevelt refused. To do so, he declared, would be utterly unsportsmanlike. In that moment, Roosevelt was not just following his personal conscience. He was making a public demonstration of the fair chase doctrine he had helped write 15 years earlier. He was living by the code. Word of the president's refusal to shoot the tethered bear spread rapidly. The story was picked up by newspapers across the country, and on November 16, 1902, the Washington Post published a political cartoon by Clifford Berryman depicting the scene. The cartoon was titled, "Drawing the Line in Mississippi," a clever double entendre referring to both the hunting incident and a political border dispute Roosevelt was in the state to mediate. In Berryman's initial drawing, the bear was depicted as a large, haggard animal. But in subsequent cartoons, the bear began to shrink, its features softening until it became a small, frightened, and sympathetic cub. This sentimental image captured the public's imagination. In Brooklyn, New York, a candy shop owner named Morris Mictum saw the cartoon and had an idea. His wife, Rose, sewed a small stuffed toy bear out of plush velvet. Mictum placed it in his shop window and, in a stroke of marketing genius, wrote to the president to ask for permission to call his creation Teddy's Bear. Roosevelt, amused, gave his consent, though he doubted his name would be worth much in the bear business. He was famously wrong. The toy was an instant sensation, and Mictum soon founded the ideal toy company to mass-produce what became a global icon. The birth of the teddy bear marked the final fascinating transformation in this long, historical arc. A complex, adult code of conduct, forged in response to a national crisis and championed by an elite group of sportsmen-statesmen, was translated into a universal symbol of childhood innocence and comfort. The story of Roosevelt's principal stand, facilitated by the incredible skill of Holt Collier, became immortalized not in a history book or a legal statute, but in a child's toy. This act of cultural alchemy ensured that the spirit of Roosevelt's decision, a spirit of compassion for the vulnerable and respect for the wild, would be passed down through generations, embedding a simple but powerful conservation message into the very fabric of American life.